What's up, summoners? King Blair here. With Season 4 of RTA in full swing, as well as the Epic 7 World Cup currently being streamed, I wanted to make a video talking about the previous RTA seasons so you guys can get a glimpse of how RTA used to be and how much we've evolved from the past, but how much, at the end of the day, we're still very similar to how we used to be in the past. But with that, if you like the video, make sure you like, subscribe, and join the Discord server, link down in the description. But without further ado, let's get right into it. So again, we're going to be going through all the RTA metas in the past. So from Season 1, that was a very early season. There was a lot of heroes that weren't around at the time. On to Season 2, which is a little bit more recent, but it's still like about 6 months ago. It's still quite a far time back. And then, of course, talking about Season 3, which is probably still fresh in your minds, and kind of how that's going to shape Season 4 and how that's going to keep moving forward as the Epic 7 meta progresses. So hopefully this is kind of like a cool, insightful look at the past. And to do this, we are going to be taking a look at the previous most banned heroes from Epic 7. So if you look here, we can actually see the old drafts, and man, they used to have some wonky drafts. So this one is a top 5. It's released by Epic 7 of the top 5 most banned heroes in Arena Season 1. So in the past, in Arena Season 1, there used to not be almost any Arbiter Vildred checks. Rowana did not exist. Last Order Crawl did not exist. SSB was very powerful. Arbiter Vildred, there was no Emo Haste. There was no Tamato Luluka, right? I think it was only like Lilibet, right? Who you can't really use for RTA. So again, things were a lot simpler, right? There was not that many tanks, and because of that, Faithless Lidica had just gotten her buff. She was pretty much in a lot of places, right? It's one of the reasons people hate Cleave to this day, is because Cleave was actually a very powerful team in Season 1 RTA. It was very, very powerful. You also have Craw, who you may be wondering, why was he banned so often? Well, he used to be the premier knight, right? You used to have Fallen Cecilia, but you'll see later on there was another unit that's on this list that kind of put this Fallen Cecilia in check, and there wasn't as many combos with Fallen Cecilia as there are now, right? So because of that, Craw being very powerful, one thing that was actually kind of Craw stands for, so if F Lidica stands for Cleave, with Cleave being very strong Season 1, Craw stood for the water meta. Yo, water meta was real. It used to be Diani, SSB, and Craw was such a good team core. Because of this, units like Alencia used to be extremely powerful in Season 2. They were some of the best units that you could have because you were able to strip the Diani and do really well against Seaside, since Seaside didn't have that many counters, right? Violet used to see some play just to try to counter Seaside and Craw. The other thing is RTA back in the day with Frenzy used to be based on damage. It wasn't like it wouldn't increase attack, it would increase damage, meaning Cross Horse at Frenzy 5 would kill almost anything in the game if it was half health, right? So it was very, very powerful Craw S3. But even then, it wasn't abused as often, since games typically didn't last that long, right? We usually only got to decent Frenzy, right? Then we also get number 4. And of course, they talk about the units. Seaside Bologna. Again, this unit did not have almost any counters. First pick Seaside Bologna was a real thing. At one point, that's what everyone was first picking. It was, if you're not first picking Seaside Bologna, you're doing something wrong. She was that popular. I still remember when I used to play the season, I used to prevent Seaside every single time because I wanted to play with Kayron, right? So Seaside, extremely powerful. The big DPS that you used to have with Craw Diani, right? Because she would just tear apart team. Still very relevant to today, right? So pretty interesting to see how it's still relevant to today. And even some of these other ones with Faithless Lidica not being as strong and Cleave overall not being as strong. So that one was the number 2, and then of course, or number 3, and then of course number 2, Bazaar. This is the reason why you didn't see FCC that often. With the dominance of Cleave, as well as Bazaar, as well as there not being that many Cleave counters, right? Sage Ball wasn't that big of a Cleave counter. There was a lot of different ways to get around that. He was kind of like the crack that would crack tank teams wide open and just set up for a Cleave, right? You could use him in a Cleave, or you could use him to stop people from bruisering. It was one of the reasons why he saw a tremendous amount of play, and also just the fact that you can push back and get turn 1. Turn 1 back then used to be crazy, right? Cleave was actually very strong. Again, unless you're playing the full water team with Seaside Bologna, he was just really good. Also, just stops Diani, right? So stops Diani and stops Fallen Cecilia. So incredibly good character, still amazing even to today. Still does his job like he's supposed to, stops units from stacking too many buffs, but it was only him, right? So that's why he often did get banned and why you didn't see him as often. And then of course Arbiter Vildred, again, there was no Emo Haste, right? Emo Haste, he wasn't around, right? So it was pretty interesting season 1 RTA meta. Some other things that I want to kind of talk about, kind of adding on some other units that were really good at the time. One unit was actually Apocalypse Ravi. Apocalypse Ravi was absolutely ridiculously good because she was a tanky unit that would not die to most traditional cleaves back in the day. It was very hard to take her out because of her passive, and she come back and revive an ally with S3. People used to run counter set, 140 speed, 25k HP, ridiculous Apocalypse Ravis that were dummy tanky with a bunch of counter attack and just were there to stop cleaves. Very, very good unit, and the S3 was just ridiculous. Lilias, again, it didn't talk about, but Lilias was also just a monster because of the dual attack and the S3. And if you did, there was no Seaside, it was very powerful. Kayron, there was not that many strips besides Bazaar, right? There was no Cerise, there was no F10A. There was like not a lot of heroes that could actually deal with Kayron, right? He was sitting pretty. If you had immunity buff on him, you would probably keep it. And I used to run a speed one because it was just like there's not that many things that really stunned, right? Control wasn't as big back then. It was mostly just Cleave and Bruiser. So there was a lot of really cool units in season 1. I'm probably missing a couple that some people are gonna be like, man, don't you remember this one? Like that one was terrible. But for the most part, it was a pretty fun season, right? It was the first time. We also had Dizzy, who started coming out near the end. And she was also starting to become a big force near the end of season 1. But you wouldn't really see her prevalence until mid-season 2. So that was kind of like season 1. Very early, very experimental. Essentially, most of the problems were due to Arbiter, Wilder, and Seaside not having actual counters. And Cleave just being very powerful. Because again, there was not a lot of counters. It was because of this season that people pretty much hated Cleave. And this was going to be pretty much the last season that you would actually are going to be seeing Cleave. Now let's look at season 2 with the top 5 most drafted, and this is going to start looking more like current times, if not worse than current times. So kind of preview, there was 2 parts to this RTA season 2. At the beginning, it was a lot of Dizzy, right? Dizzy used to be an amazing unit, and it was very similar to Season 1, with just some more counters and checks, right? Falconeer Chloe was like an MVP this season. Falconeer Chloe was absolutely insane, and I think they will show it here. But let's actually look at the picks, and then I'll give a little bit extra breakdown. So here we still see Seaside as a dominant force. At this point, we already had Rowana mid-season 2, and by the end of season 2, we had Last Rider Crawl. So there was 2 different checks to Seaside Bellona, which is one of the reasons that she dropped a lot in usage, but still seeing play. I mean, if you don't have the answers to Seaside, you are going to lose to Seaside Bellona, right? So that season 2, you didn't get the introduction of Crawl near the end, and you had Rowana nearest the middle, so she still got to see a lot of play, especially because people used to also ban Rowana and pick SSB. Right, and it used to be absolutely ridiculous, right? If you would just like chance it, bend the Rowana, first pick SSB, you probably could still climb pretty easily. So again, SSB was still a very prevalent force in the meta, and of course, again, especially early on in the season, very similar to season 1 things. But we also started seeing the rise of Rylet. Why? Again, he was able to dodge damage. Teams were starting to get a little bit tankier. Could Luxac cleave? There was more answers to cleave. So the meta was already starting to get more Bruiser. And near the end of season 2, we were pretty much getting to a tank meta, right? And you'll start seeing with some of the other picks, and I'll break it down for you. But near the end, it was very, very tank meta. And it used to be based on damage. And Remnant Violet was really good at the time because he would just do so much freaking damage turn 1, and he could potentially take out the DPS on the enemy side with his S3, right? There used to not be that many lifesteal Rylets. It was almost all speed Rylets to speed contest Falconeer Chloris, and him and Falconeer Chloe were like best friends, right? You would Falconeer Chloe S3 someone, come in with Rylet, and one-shot a tank or anything, right? It was a very popular combo at the time, very, very standard, and very, very scary, and one of the best combos. It's still a really good combo to today, but it was particularly good back then because people used to build extremely good fast Rylets to one-shot DPSs and then just out-sustain with Rylet because they can't kill him, and Rylet would just pop off, right? Because Frenzy was also a little bit slower. So again, Remnant Violet, really, really good, right? The chance to RNG, he's the RNG unit. And of course, you can't have Rylet without Falconeer Chloe. Falconeer Chloe, this was even post-buff. Post-nerf, right? Falconeer Chloe has actually gotten nerfed in the past. She used to be a lot better. Her S3 had 1 less cooldown, and she used to get extra turns a lot more often. So Falconeer Chloe, number 3 unit, again, she was good against Bruisers. It's still to this day is an amazing unit, but there was no Guiding Light, right? Stennet wasn't as popular at the time. She was starting to gain popularity, but Stennet was not that big of a threat at the time Falconeer Chloe was around. So for the most part, any unit was susceptible to Falconeer Chloe. This is also why we would see Lilias with very fast Liliuses to force Falconeer Cluries onto the Lilius and waste the F Cluries S3 rather than them going on your DPS, because you would go right after the Falconeer Clury and you would cleanse the Falconeer Cluries S3 if they didn't go on your Lilius. So we did see a lot of speed Lilius at the time. It was mainly to counter Falconeer Clury, again stopping the combo with Rylet to take out the DPS early in the fight. So very, very cool stuff. Before Guiding Light's time, really, really fun overall. And then of course Fallen Cecilia. This is where you start seeing the dominance of tanks, and Fallen Cecilia is no stranger to this, right? Fallen Cecilia, to this day, people still underestimate how powerful this unit is. People still are like, King, why is she so good? All she does is put a barrier up. Well, she puts a barrier, you can build a bruiser, she provokes down a unit permanently. The cycling barrier is just a massive heal that even in Frenzy, it kind of scales a little bit, right? Because it's a pretty thick barrier and you're essentially giving them more of a heal that can also overcap them with healing, giving them supplemental health. She was very big for also protecting Rylet and the big DPSs, right? Like Seaside Bellona that could take out entire teams. It was very protect the castle team comp. Very similar to today, but more tank style, right? So Fallen Cecilia, and of course, there was also the full tank teams. Near the end, it was becoming something that was all tank teams, right? So Falconeer Clury and Rylet were able to bust these tank teams since Falconeer Clury could strip and Rylet could one-shot a knight at the very beginning. But Fallen Cecilia made it considerably harder if they didn't have Rylet, right? If it was tank versus tank, Fallen Cecilia teams would probably win because you would have a massive barrier. And if you timed your S3, you could stop a crawl from S3 in your team. So Fallen Cecilia, I mean, she's still really good to this day. I think she's even better than she used to be because there's more broken combos for her. And then, of course, number one, we have Arbiter Vildred. This one should not come to a surprise to a lot of people. Why? Again, he was put in every single cleave, right? If you were cleaving, Arbiter Vildred was there. If you were countering cleave, you were picking Arbiter Vildred. And because of Gab, if there's no Fallen Cecilia on the board, if you ban the Fallen Cecilia, he can destroy a lot of teams with greater attack buff, right? This one is a little bit skewed for the actual high ranks. So Arbiter Vildred was stomping lower ranks because cleave was still very popular and teams were known as Bruiser. But higher up, near the end of the season, it was not that crazy, right? So here you start seeing the rise of Bruisers, right? You're starting to see more Rylet, more FCC, more Falconeer Clury, right? More of like those like take out their DPS and win the game, right? That was kind of what it was becoming. If your DPS could survive, you would win the game, and it'd be that way. One thing that this does not show was one of the worst metas, in my opinion, was the tank meta that happened in Season 2. And Season 2, most people only remember the tank meta. What was the tank meta, you may ask? Well, this was when Blood Moon Haste was at his peak. He was one of the most broken units at end of Season 2. Why? He countered Arbiter Vildred, so he wasn't able to cleave your team and pop all your tanks. And on top of that, had a massive S3 that would just full team heal you. The fact that this penetrated defense and did extra damage, he would get Portrait of the Saviors. And in Frenzy 4, back in Season 2, Frenzy used to be a damage increase, not an attack increase. So Blood Moon Haste, his S3, even though his health is dropping, would end up doing like 12k in Frenzy. Right? Just ridiculous amounts with Portrait. If you had Emo Haste late game, you were one-shotting any unit in this game in Frenzy. And that was kind of the rise that began with Frenzy 8 teams. This was the start where tank teams were finally starting to dominate, right? Before Season 1, yeah, Cleaves was very awesome. You had you still have Bruiser with like Blue Craw, Seaside, Dieni, right? Just blocking people out with Bruisers and buffs. And you had Bassar to kind of crack those teams. Emil Hayes was the start of the tank meta. But he was not alone, right? You also had Crawl being very heavily picked higher ranks because, again, the S3 people starting to abuse this S3. People would legit just pick 5 knights and 2 like supports, essentially. Like Emil Hayes, 3 knights, and Ruel, right? And that was it. Because this S3 would one-shot any unit. Emil Hayes S3 would one-shot any unit. This was also the time that Ambitious Tywin got his buff. You would just get to Frenzy. You get a massive damage increase. You soul burn that bad boy. Boom. Stun everyone on the board. GG. What do? Right? Not that many immunity setters. Right? Then you also had Last Rider Crow. Who, again, in a tank versus tank, who wins? The person that can do more true damage. Right? Last Rider Crow, again, with Frenzy, was doing more damage because of Frenzy used to be damage, not attack percentage increase. Was incredibly powerful and was actually the reason why we started the tank meta as well. Him and Emil Hayes were the ones that just began it, right? Because you could pick him, you would pick Last Rider Crow first pick, pray that like they would have to take Crow, but if they grab Crow, then you grab Emil Hayes, say Tywin, right? So it was very, very frustrating to play against. He was doing like 6, 7, 8k in his S3s like throughout the match. Just ridiculous amount of damage. Hit him and Milhaze. It just made it why not pick out tanks? They can't kill you. They can't cleave you. But you can tank them and just kill them with true damage that would just kill any unit, right? ML has a 3, kill any squishy. Last Order Crawl has 3, almost pop a whole team, right? A Tywin, do a ton of AoE damage. Crawl, take out our unit. And then have Ruel to back you up. Or Lilius, right? To do extra damage with dual attacks. So that was Season 2, was the beginning of the tank meta. The beginning of tank domination. And one of the reasons why I personally hated that meta, right? I despise that meta, right? So that meta was not a good time. I did not enjoy it. A lot of people didn't enjoy it. But then we got to Season 3. Season 3 was introduction of the new frenzy changes, where you, instead of getting damage increase, you were getting attack percentage increase. Why was it significant? It kind of slowed down the full tank compositions, right? Because now your Crawl wasn't doing as much damage as he used to be. Your Emil Hayes wasn't just dunking on everyone. Your Ruel also losing FRES meant that in late fights, you could actually provoke down Ruels with Fallen Cecilia. There used to not be an effectiveness increase, right? So if you had a 180 FRES Ruel, that 180 FRES Ruel was never getting debuffed, right? So that new change with the effectiveness and increasing attack rather than damage raw made those bulky tank teams that had 0 DPSs not as popular, right? And we get to the start of Season 3. And Season 3 was again split into 3 different sections. The first section is going to be the beginning, right? When people are still getting used to Frenzy, which is probably the best time that I honestly think it was the most diverse RTA season. Control was meta, with Sage Ball and a Tywin kind of leading the charge on that. Then you also had Cleave being very powerful, with the new Cerise buffs being able to be very good for Cleave teams, as well as having the Faithless Lidica and all the good stuff that they used to have. And for Bruisers, you still had Fallen Cecilia, you still had Crawl, you still had ways to bulk up and do damage, you had Ravi, you had T. Surin still, right? So there was a lot, all the playstyles were equally balanced. And then you got to mid part of Season 3, and it was all about control because of F10A. Right? People did not have their control counters because they were so used to Season 1 of RTA to not really having that frenzy reduce their FRES, right? So that made the domination of things like Fairy Tail Tenebria just everywhere, right? FCC Fairy Tail Tenebria would just destroy everything. People didn't have immunity units built at the time. People didn't have a lot of ways to deal with it, right? So Cerise, F10A, a Tywin, Sage Ball, control was very dominant during the mid-season of Season 3, and then at the very end we're slowly going back to a Bruiser tank meta. So let's look at the units that were the most picked and banned this season, and it usually takes the whole season into consideration. This one does start with the number 1, so we're going to be going to the number 5. Number 5, we get Landy and Stene. So why? So Landy, it's the best way to crack a team wide open, right? Especially near the end of Season 3, where we're getting those massive tank teams with General Purgus, FCC, Last Rider Crawl. She was the one that could stop those teams, but at the same time, she was enabling those teams. Because now you had a unit that could AoE attack, give everyone speed buff, and you would just cycle your tanks over and over again. Same thing with Spectre Tenebria. They're the only units that do tons of damage against tanks, are really hard to take away because of Guiding Light, right? And this is the other thing that made Falconeer Clury kind of drop off. We talked about Season 2, Falconeer Clury, amazing, right? You take out their DPS as GG. Well, in Season 3, you can't reach Landy, and you definitely cannot reach Spectre Tenebria with Falconeer Clury. So Falconeer Clury had dropped off a lot during the season, and she still is not seeing the same level of play that she used to because of these two, right? They're the DPSs that force AoE and enable things like Last Rider Crawl, enable things like General Purgus that can give them attack buff. So very, very dominant units in the meta, both in the beginning and later on, because Stene, I mean, she's still one of the best cleave units as well as she is for Bruisers. Landy, same thing, amazing for cleave, amazing for Bruisers. Then you have number 4, Fairy Tail Tenebria. As we mentioned, that whole mid-section of RTA Season 3 was all Fairy Tail Tenebria. And Fairy Tail Tenebria has changed the game forever, because we will never have a true control team be as successful as it was. Because of Fairy Tail Tenebria, we got things like Emma Lilibet. We got things like, we got all the different people building their FRES units, right? We got things like DJ Bazaar, things like Ray, right? All these units people had in the background They built them because of Fairy Tail Tenebria. And now that people have it, because they need to watch out for her, it's just a lot worse. She's the only real control unit you can use aside from a Tywin. Besides a Tywin and besides Fairy Tail Tenebria, you really don't see control that much because she was such an oppressive unit, and she was absolutely oppressive. And because of her, control is no longer going to be that good unless they release a ridiculous control unit. Because of her, right? She just phased out most control units, right? Broman's not consistent. She is, right? Broman doesn't win you the game. Well, he does win you the game with an S3, but you guys get the point. Fairy Tail Tenebria, ridiculously powerful, still is powerful to this day. Arbiter Vildred, you may be surprised. Why is he only number 3, right? The past 2 times, he was like number 1 each time, right? Why has he dropped so much? Arbiter Vildred is not doing anything to current teams. General Purgus, Last Rider Craw, Fallen Cecilia, all these units that are just super bulky, and then things like Guiding Light that make it hard for you to reach them, and people building their Stennis with super high defense, it just makes it so he can't really crack the teams like he used to. He used to be able to crack tank teams if he got a gap. Now it's just not reliable. And we also have things like Top Monoluluka that are way more common. We have things like Emil Haste that are way more common that just kind of put Arbiter Vildred in check, right? There's a lot of different things that can actually check him now. And he's not the same monster that he used to be. Is it still frustrating to lose to a Gav Arby? Of course. He's still a good unit. And we did see the rise of Deej and Arby during the season because he needed to keep up with the times. Because we're going back to tank and bruisers, he needs to be able to be paired with those units and not just get absolutely walled out and depleted by General Purgus. So again, Arbiter Vildred definitely not as good anymore. And kind of showing that almost all the units here were the top 2 tanky. Last Rider Craw. I mean, he was the same from Season 2. Right, he came from Season 2 and basically drove Season 3. This guy has made the meta always be tanky. You always have to think about Last Rider Craw. Because if you're picking full tank teams, they'll pick Last Rider Craw. GG. Super powerful unit. Essentially has driven the meta to where it is with the barriers and facilitating things like Fairy Tail Tenebria and not Fairy Tail Tenebria, facilitating things like Spectre Tenebria and Landy. And then, of course, to top it all off, Fallen Cecilia. This unit is just getting better with time. There's more DPSs that want protection, right? So more and more DPSs want protection. So what does that mean? They are going to be using Fallen Cecilia because Fallen Cecilia is the best defensive unit in the game. So all those people that used to say, oh, Fallen Cecilia is not that good, right? She's the number 1 most picked unit. Why? She just enables so much good stuff. But this doesn't capture everything that happened. One of the units that made a massive splash near the end, and today's meta is just absolutely wrecking everything and driving the meta forward is going to be General freaking Purgus. This dude came near the end of the season and just stuck perfectly right in there. And we are going back to a very tank meta because of General Purgus and all these other knights that are not only tanky but can do damage. It was the exact same problem they tried to fix from Season 2 to Season 3, but they were unable to fix it because they kept releasing units that just do a lot of damage with critical hit damage and are bulky. General Purgus, case in point. Amazing, amazing unit. This also makes things like Briar Witch Iseria be extremely potent in the current meta game because you're able to S3 enemies and strip them kind of like a Bazaar. And Bazaar, again, still extremely powerful, still extremely threatening, and it also reveals things like Landy because Guiding Light is such a menace. You have to have ways to reach Landy and Guiding Light units and things like Fairy Tail Tenebria. So that is going to be Season 3, which leads us to Season 4, which is all about the unknown right now. The one big unit that we're getting that is new is going to be Troublemaker Croisset, being extremely good right now, fitting right into the tank meta and just kind of expanding on that tank meta and kind of opening a little bit more of doorways for more of those Landy standard units to come out because he has this massive passive that makes him extremely tanky, right? So Troublemaker Croisset, just absolutely insane in blocking out units and keeping your DPSs alive. So what do I see from Season 4? So one thing we kind of saw was at the beginning, there was a lot of diversity in Season 1. No one really knew the metagame. Season 2, we started going more into tank and bruisers, and you stopped seeing Cleave as much. Season 3, Cleave is pretty much on like its last leg, right? It's not doing too hot as it used to be. There's almost no top 100 legend players that are solo cleavers now. Very, very few legend players are solo cleavers. In season 3, it was almost all tanks because it was just so powerful, right? And now season 4, again, it is very similar. We are still in a very, very tanky meta. Why? Because tanks just work. Why risk cleaving when there are counters to cleave? But bruisers, you have a massive toolbox that you can just pull something and counter another enemy, right? So with that, it's one of the reasons that we're always going to see tank teams from now on. They would have to make another frenzy change or something crazy, because even in the Epic 7 World Cup, where we have the 2 pre-bans, we're still seeing primarily bruisers, but a little bit more diversity, right? So that's the only thing I could see bringing back more diversity would be something like a double ban, right? But as of right now, season 4, you can expect a very tanky meta again with Last Rider Crawl, Fallen Cecilia, General Purgus, a Tywin, all these tank units that have been good in the past, Crawl, and now Robbie, who is a monster of a bruiser, just staying relevant in today's meta since Robbie can actually block teams out, right? So again, that's a little bit of a trip down memory lane for all you old players that have been around since season 1. Hopefully the new players that are here now can kind of appreciate how far we've actually come, right? How many different metas there are. If you want a summary on everything, essentially, season 1 is the new meta. It's SSB Arby's days. Season 2 was most notable for the tank meta. Season 3 is most notable for the F10A meta, the control meta, and ending with the General Purgus meta. And Season 4, will it be the first section will be all about Landy, Stanet, T-Crosset, and G-Purg, or will we see near the end another meta that comes up with the collab that comes out soon? But hopefully y'all enjoyed the video and found it informative. But that's all I got for you guys today. I will see y'all next time. Peace.